I'm Joanna Santa Barbara, co-chair of Nelson Tasman Climate Forum, and I'll open with a karakia before introducing our event and our speaker. And this karakia calls on the children of the Sky Father Ranginui and Earth Mother Papatua Nuku, and calls take care of the house of Tane, the forest. And if I don't, then we won't have a healthy forest. Take care of the waters of Tangaroa. And if you don't take care of them, we won't have healthy waters. And take care of the atmosphere of Tawhiri Matea. And if he doesn't, we won't have a healthy atmosphere. Kia hiwa rā e ngā teina o te taiao, a ranginui rawa ko papa tua nuku. Tia kina te whare nui a tāne. Ki te kore au, ka kore te whare ora. Tia kina te wai a Tangaroa. Ki te kore koe, ka kore te wai ora. Tia kina te hau a Tawhiri Mātea. Ki te kore ia, ka kore te hau ora. Tia kina, tihei Maori ora. Thank you. So let's begin this event in a series of events in the Climate Action Festival 2025, held by Nelson Tasman Climate Forum. And the theme of this entire festival is the world we want. And we want a world where we acknowledge that we, humankind, are just one node in the miraculous web of life. And we stand humbly before the landscape and the seascape and acknowledge it without trying to exploit and dominate them. These matters are very raw here in the top of the South at the moment, with people still hurting badly from the July floods. And let me take a moment to quote from a poem written very recently by a person who was severely affected by the flood. I think the writer of this poem is with us, and her name happens to be River Seligman. And she wrote, "The world moves on, but the rain on the roof, it doesn't sound the same. I hear danger in my body, the sound of broken dreams, hopes and hard work washed out to sea." So we need to do much better, and we need to begin by understanding. And our guide to understanding today is Tom Kay, and welcome, Tom.
Thank you for having me.
Tom is a science communicator and an environmental scientist, as well as an organizer and spokesperson for the organization called Choose Clean Water, which advocates for the health of fresh water in New Zealand. He specializes in understanding how our management of the environment, particularly how our land use and so-called flood protection, impacts our rivers and communities. He's here today to talk about how we can live alongside our rivers more safely as our climate warms, a topic of particular importance to Nelson Tasman Climate Forum as we move further into addressing adaptation to climate change. So thank you, Tom, for being with us. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Kia ora. Yeah, thank you so much. I'll just kick off. Presuming everyone can see everything all right, and anyone can just correct me if anything happens with slides or sound or anything like that. So, as mentioned, I'm Tom. I have been advocating for this idea of making room for rivers for several years now, which we'll get into, but having worked up until relatively recently at Forest and Bird, I focused on freshwater and freshwater advocacy, and while there started this campaign to make room for rivers after being somewhat frustrated, I guess, that in New Zealand we talk a lot about water quality and water quantity, but we don't necessarily talk about the shape of our rivers or what they look like and whether there's habitat there and whether they can flood safely. So it's a big known fact that many of our rivers are sick. We can't swim in them, we can't use them for drinking water sources, but there's also this other problem of the rivers and the shape of them themselves and their flooding. So we started this campaign, and we've, while I was at Forest and Bird, went all around the country talking to councils, because just after we launched the campaign we had Cyclone Gabrielle and the Auckland anniversary floods hit, and we thought there's this urgent need to go around and help people understand why it is that this is happening. So this talk is a continuation of that kind of campaign. I've left Forest and Bird, but I've continued on this work, and this is a version of what has been taken to many councils and communities around the country. I don't know if anyone recognises this picture here. It's probably very familiar to you in your region, but it's not your region. This is from Hawke's Bay. It's the Tutaikuri River. And on the morning of the 14th of February in 2023, when Cyclone Gabrielle was coming down on the east coast of the North Island, I was following what was happening in this river very, very closely. In particular, I was watching the flow gauge on this river. So through the night, I'll get a little pointer up here, through the night on the 13th of February, basically this river was rising. You can see the flow in the river rising here. Up the side of the graph we've got the flow, along the bottom we've got the time here. You can see this is basically midnight coming into the early morning, and this river was rising and rising and rising, and I sat on the Regional Council website refreshing this web page, trying to find out at about 8 o'clock on the morning of the 14th if this river was continuing to rise or not. You can probably see that actually the river went to 0 litres per second, or there was zero flow in the river at about 3 a.m. and that wasn't true. What had actually happened was that the gauge had failed at 3 a.m. The river had risen so much that it had destroyed the recording infrastructure. I wanted to know what was happening in this river because my family lives just downstream from this gauging station. They live about 600 metres from the river. My family, my mum and dad and my family home, the one I grew up in, and then my sister and my niece and nephew at the time in another house a bit closer to the river. The river was flowing at about 1,800 cumecs at that point when the flow gauge failed. By the morning it was flowing at something like 4,000 cumecs, so 4,000 cubic metres of water past that point every second. At about 8 a.m. the river started to overtop the stop banks. This is the river in the centre here, flowing downstream, taking out this little power substation here which cut off power to most of Napier. And then at about 10 a.m. the river overtopped stop banks further downstream, and everyone in these suburbs around the river was being told to evacuate. So this is an area called Waiheke here in Hawke's Bay, and this is, I say here, in these photos at least, and this is Taradale, the suburb where my family lived. So the river was backing up against this bridge here and skirting around the top of a stop bank, which starts just here where the land gets a bit lower, and water was flowing down into the suburb, as well as, of course, having completely inundated the stop banks and things on this side of the river. This was my sister's street on the left there, the river in the distance, water basically flowing down this street, and this was the intersection near their house. My parents' house was a couple of hundred metres further away around the corner. They were really lucky. They were evacuated essentially. My dad came around and helped get the kids, left my sister's house. They went to my parents' house, which was thankfully drier. The water came up under this house here to the floorboard, well, almost to the floorboards, but thankfully not touching them, so no long-term damage, but a pretty scary event, and they evacuated out of the suburb completely to friends' places. This is the bridge that we were just looking at. This is containers and things that were smashed down into it. This is Waiheke being flooded on the other side. You can actually see water in people's houses here. And yeah, just very lucky that my family got out pretty much unscathed. This is what that bridge looked like a few months after the floods. You can just see how much water was up underneath that, how wide the river had got. That bridge has only just been replaced relatively recently, or temporarily replaced. And as you move further upstream, you saw the scale of the devastation. This sort of stuff won't be unfamiliar to you, unfortunately. This is upstream near Dartmoor. The whole floodplain basically inundated, cars picked up and thrown around paddocks, barn doors blown open, houses flooded, all sorts of scary stuff. When you step back and look at the entire region of Hawke's Bay after the cyclone, or the entire this sort of Napier Hastings area, you can see the extent of what happened during the event. So up here we've got Napier and Taradale. I think I've labelled it. There you go. That's Taradale in here. So this is the Tutaukuri River coming down. This is the Ngaruroro River, another river coming down north of Hastings. So Hastings is just off to the bottom if you know the area. This is pre-cyclone, so everything looks green, lush kind of thing. If you compare that imagery to post-cyclone, you can just see how brown and stained the whole landscape is with floodwaters. When you step back a little bit further and look at those two rivers and their stop bank networks, or their supposed flood protection networks, you can see kind of how the network actually failed in some places and made things worse, and sort of helped in other places, but how it didn't work the way that it was intended, or we had hoped, I guess. All these lines on this map here are stop banks. So the yellow lines, this is a couple of months after the cyclone, the yellow lines were all the stop banks that were still intact. The green bits were bits that had broken in some way or weakened and already been patched up at that point. Orange was still weakened, red was still breached, and you can see from the number of discoloured bits of stop bank how many breaches and weakened points across the entire network they were. These are stop banks that are the big earthen mounds that are meant to keep water in the channel during a large flood. Interestingly, what happened during the cyclone is this, like for example in Taradale where my family lives, there was a stop bank that had just been increased in height by about 1 metre, I think. It had literally just been finished a few months before the cyclone. Even with that increase in height, the water backed up against the bridge and snuck around the top of it and flooded parts of the suburb. Thankfully, the stop bank didn't give way, only a few houses were kind of red-stickered. But in other places where the stop bank gave way, water entered the floodplain. So for example, here at Motio, this big bit of stop bank here had several breaches in it, water came into this old part of the floodplain. Down here at Fern Hill, all these breaches here, water came into this part of the floodplain. Once the water was in that part of the floodplain, it kept going downstream towards Pakowhai, joined by that water from Waiheke that we were just looking at. All of this water from the river came into the spot here, and as you can see from the stop banks, hopefully, had nowhere to go once it was there, because it was on the wrong side of the stop bank. It actually backed up against these banks. There is a pumping station there that's meant to take water out of that area back into the river. It was completely overwhelmed, and that area there filled up like a bathtub. Only when it was 5 or 6 metres deep, when it could get back over the stop bank, could it drain back out into the river. And that's why we saw people in Hawke's Bay being rescued off their rooftops in Pakowhai by helicopters and by boats. Those are a couple of photos there from some of the families that were rescued out of Pakowhai. This is the ridge of the first story of their house. Several other buildings there. You can see just how deep these floodwaters were, because that water got onto the wrong side of the stop bank and filled the place up like a bathtub. When you look at more localized impacts across the region, this is an example of from the Ngaruroro. You can see the power that these floodwaters have. So this is pre-cyclone, the stop banks here along the river with these lime pathways. When you compare that to post-cyclone, you can see just how much damage this floodwater can do if it gets on top of those or over those stop banks. So these breaches here, all these different holes in the stop bank, they've basically happened when the water's got so high that it's come over the top of the stop bank, and then it's rapidly back eroded through the stop banking and made a big hole that water's then blasted out onto the stop bank through. There's lots of houses in here at Omahu and a marae that were flooded, and then of course all this water here contributed to that flooding further downstream. When you look at places like the Esk Valley, pre-cyclone, you can see it here, relatively green and lush. That had no stop bank network. Entire floodplain was inundated with floodwaters and sediment. Interestingly, if you wanted to put a stop bank network there, it would have to be something like 4 meters high. It would take up a third of the valley floor. You'd have to find the material to build it. And even then, it probably would have been overwhelmed by the floodwaters. So you can just see these rivers and the power they have of doing the things that they do. And other places in Hawke's Bay, we had a lake created that wasn't usually there. This is the Tukituki River in central Hawke's Bay, Waipawa here. This basically was created when the river jumped out of its current channel, entered this old channel, and filled up this depression in the landscape before it drained back into the normal Tukituki channel. And of course, the hillsides of Hawke's Bay were stripped of their soils, similarly to what happens in your region during flooding and heavy rainfall. Of course, Cyclone Gabriel was massive. It was a huge, huge event, but it wasn't the only huge event we had. Just before it, we had the Auckland anniversary floods, literally the weekend before. Not long before that, a couple of months before, we had flooding down your way in Nelson, of course, which I thought was kind of crazy and unprecedented at the time. Before that, we had the Ashburton River, the Hakateri in 2022. This is just a selection of events, of course, as well. Westport and the West Coast, 2021, but floods regularly. The Rangitata River in 2019, coming out of its usual channel. And what I thought of as kind of that iconic, for want of a better word, flood in Edgecombe in 2017, when this section of stop bank wasn't even overtopped. It actually just gave way. It got so soft and inundated with floodwaters that water just spilled through into the floodplain and into people's houses. Since then, we've had Wairoa in 2024. This is after the cyclone. Otago in October last year with serious flooding. The West Coast in November last year. We had Christchurch in May this year. Tasman, of course, in June, July. And literally just a couple of days ago, really, the North Island with flooding around Waitomo and some North Island towns there. So this is a huge, huge problem. Flooding is our #1 natural hazard in New Zealand. After Cyclone Gabriel, Dr. Sam Dean from NIWA said, "I have no doubt in my mind that climate change has influenced that event." And Met Service said these events will become more severe as the planet continues to warm. That will mean heavier rain and more problems from flooding. And we see that playing out in the data. This is a graph of rainfall at Auckland Airport across time. Basically, you've got the amount of rain here on the left. You've got all the months of the year along the bottom here, January through to December. And all of these lines here are historic rainfall records through the year. This red line, of course, is 2023. This very vertical section here is the Auckland anniversary flood weekend. All of that rainfall in one go. And you'll remember they had a heavier rain event a few weeks later probably. That's there. So huge, huge amounts of rainfall. The planet is continuing to heat up very rapidly. This is just a quick graphic I pulled showing those temperature anomalies across time, and you can see how we are increasingly getting closer and closer to that 1.5 degree target that we were thinking we might stay below. The prediction that I found this morning was that at the rate we're going, we're going to exceed that 1.5 degrees permanently from about May 2029. So this is not getting better. So what does that mean in terms of climate change and increased rainfall and things like that? It basically means our extreme weather events are going to get more extreme, and the stuff that we have now is going to happen more often. If you imagine that this is a probability sort of distribution graph, it shows or conceptualizes how much or how often we get these sort of extreme events. If you imagine this dark grey line is the distribution of our current weather. Most of our weather occurs in the middle here. It's the stuff we expect day to day. It's relatively normal, and it's a high probability because it's a big area under that curve. And then we get these extreme events out the tail ends, these little ones, and that has a low probability of occurring generally, that little black area. But as the climate shifts, that distribution is going to be dragged out sideways, and what we think of as extreme now is going to have a much higher probability because of a larger area under that curve, and we're going to get a new extreme with that same probability as before, way out the end as that tail drags out. So we're going to see more flooding, we're going to see larger floods, and we're going to have to learn how to deal with that and live with that, basically, as well as hopefully slowing it, but we'll get into those things. So this is a climate change problem, but it's also a problem in terms of how we have mismanaged our natural environment. Things like wetland loss, for example. This is a map showing predicted historic wetland extent across New Zealand, and you can see that we had huge areas of wetland all across New Zealand, Northland, Southland, West Coast, Manawatu. We had about 2.4 million hectares of wetland. Those are areas in the landscape that was, low-lying, they soaked up water, they held it during heavy rain, and they released it during dry periods. We've now only got about 240,000 hectares of wetland left. So on the right there, that's our current wetland extent, and you can see just how much has been drained, destroyed, lost, built on, farmed on, all sorts of things. That means those areas that were absorbing that rainfall are largely gone, or become problem areas when we have floods. It's a similar story for forest cover across New Zealand. On the left here we've got pre-human forest cover, lots of native forest across all our hillsides. On the right there we've got forest cover now, and you can see just how much forest we've taken off the hillsides. The root networks and the trees that were holding that soil on the landscape have been lost across huge areas, and you can see that we've replaced some of it in areas, including your region, with exotic forest and a lot of farmland and grassland. Where we've kept those forests, we've introduced pests like goats and deer, possums, pigs, things that undermine the ability of that forest to regenerate, to hold soil, and what that means is that makes flooding worse as well. So this is an example here from the Kaweka Forest Park, which is upstream of the Ngaruroro River, which flooded during the cyclone. And on the left here you've got an area of the forest park that has deer in it. It's accessible, well, the whole forest park has deer in it, but you can see here that there's accessible, that it's accessible to deer, and they've eaten away all the undergrowth. It's the most heavily hunted part of the Kaweka Forest Park, so it's hunted a lot. Despite that, these deer can still eat all that undergrowth. And what you've got here is no sub-canopy, no undergrowth to hold water, no trees coming up to replace these big trees when they pass away and die. But on the right here you've got an area where there's a deer exclusion fence, and you can see just how much more growth there is in that area because deer can't get in there. And all this extra vegetation, all the extra root network and everything can help hold water and hold soil on those slopes and replace that forest when the older trees die off. And we see this happening, right? The wetland loss, the forest loss, we see this play out in the landscape. This large area that was created, this big lake, that usually looks like this day to day. And when you lay over those historic maps of where we think we had wetlands in New Zealand, you can see it's all that same area. And of course Ngāti Kahungunu, the iwi in Hawke's Bay, will tell you that because they used to have mahinga kai sites there and have people living there and things, and that was a spot where you could collect food from a wetland. On the hillsides it's the same story. This is pre-cyclone imagery. Not the healthiest looking grass there, but you can see it's intact. You look at this post-cyclone and all of those white lines are landslides and landslips where that soil that's taken hundreds or thousands of years to form has disappeared. So flicking back, there's scars on the landscape here, probably from Cyclone Bowler and things, but then you flick forward and you can just see all these little gullies, slips and things is all just soil coming off. And it ends up downstream in our rivers in these big cakes of sediment like this. This is the Tutakuri again, so not connected to those hillsides, but you just see what this sediment does when it gets into the rivers. And this is the river still running brown months after the cyclone. So climate change, wetland loss, forest loss, but also the way that we have tried to manage or mismanage our rivers. So historically our rivers had space to spread across their floodplains. They built the floodplains, right? Rivers aren't just water, they also carry gravel and sediment and things, and they move back and forward and spread that across a landscape and build up a floodplain. Places like Hawke's Bay and Canterbury are so productive because of the rivers having built those floodplains. But historically when we came in, well I say when Europeans came to New Zealand and started channelizing and managing these rivers, we didn't sort of put stop banks, way out where these rivers were operating at those points. We pulled them in. So rivers like this, the Tukituki in central Hawke's Bay in 1943, which was operating in kind of this quite open, wide area and actually had big old channels elsewhere in the floodplain that you can see even in this imagery from 1943, were stop banked and channelized into these narrow areas. One landowner might want to protect their land from flooding on one side of the river, then another one, and they build independent stop banks until you've got a stop bank the whole way down the river, managed by catchment boards, with this idea that you're trying to get water out to sea as fast as possible, keeping it off people's land so that you can develop that land for farming or towns or whatever. And we've done this all around the country. So that's the Tukituki River. You can see this is the Ngaruroro River in Hawke's Bay again. This is a section of the river in 1950 laid over the sort of modern landscape. If you compare that section to what it looks like now, this big open braided river, it's hundreds of metres narrower. Still a braided river, still impressive, but not what it used to be in that spot. And we've done this all around the country, taken space from these rivers. Not only have we taken space from them, but we've also massively realigned them and changed where they flow, essentially. This is a map of Napier again, Hawke's Bay at least, and you can see the Tutakuri River coming down here, which you'll be familiar with now, although it flows north into this lagoon next to Napier. This is pre-1931 earthquake, so there was a big lagoon near Napier. The Ngaruroro River coming along here just north of Hastings, flowing out to the coast. The beach is about here, but it's been taken off this map. And you can see that these rivers flow differently to how they do now. After the earthquake, these rivers were channelized basically. Their flow was changed. The Tutakuri was shifted or stop banked to protect developing Napier on all this land that had come up. And essentially a spillway was put in here, which you can just see coming out to the coast, as well as the river still having this path north along Riverbend Road in Napier to where the lagoon used to be. The Ngaruroro River, which was flowing in this channel here, was given an overflow channel here to then meet the Tutakuri. Eventually those rivers were permanently shifted into those channels. That led to them being brought together, and that led to the bathtub problem at Pakowhai, where we had a stop bank that stopped all that water from going anywhere during the floods. So we engineered these problems essentially by changing the way that these rivers flow. And that's not to say we necessarily want the Tutakuri River flowing back in its old channel, which you can actually still see here along Riverbend Road and through the middle of Napier, but it does show you that there are consequences still to thinking you've fixed a problem in one place and creating a problem in another with our rivers. Of course, rivers like those in Canterbury are some of the biggest examples of this kind of encroachment. This is the Waioufa River. This was a map done by Newsroom. You can see just how huge the extent of that braid plain is. You compare it to what it looks like now, and you can see the development that's gone in the farmland on that old riverbed. Centre pivot irrigators and things like that, farmhouses. It's easy to find examples from literally everywhere in the country. I make a game of this sometimes when I have time to go through heaps of them, but here's one from your region. This is the Waido River, 1947 to 1948. You can actually see still, even outside of the riverbed, all these old lines in the floodplain that show you where the river's been through time. You compare that to what it looks like now, and you can see that the space has been taken away from that river, and the stop bank, I presume, runs along here somewhere where this sort of lime pathway is. Rivers as well, like the Motueka. There's actually been a study done on the Motueka looking at the space taken from it. So on the left here we've got the river in 1948 and then 2015, and these blue and red lines are the lines that the council essentially is trying to manage the river into. They're called design lines. So that's where they're trying to make the river conform to. You can see how the river's actually outside of those back in 1948 and it's been pulled into them, although you can see that it's really pushing at those edges, that they're essentially too narrow. And then here you've got the river in 1946 and around 2015-ish with the sort of wet areas, the gravel areas and the vegetation areas mapped against the floodplain, which you can just see how huge that floodplain actually is before it gets up onto those old terraces. And then you can see it here again narrowed into this 2015 wetted channel as the red one there, and you can see how that wetted channel is still trying to fight its way outside of those design lines and the space that it's had taken away from it. And they actually put some numbers on this as well. So the active channel area, for example, was reduced to 180 hectares, so it's about 73% of what it used to be. The active channel width on average is about 70% of what it used to be. So you can put numbers on these images I'm showing you as well. It's not just big rivers, it's little rivers too. This is a stream I grew up next to, the Taipo. I think it's a tributary to the Taipo, and it's just boxed completely in a concrete culvert. It looks nothing like a stream, realistically. I thought things like this were bad with the Leith and things, and then I thought about my local stream here in Wellington where I live, and this is my local stream here in Wellington. Don't know if anyone knows where this is, but this is Aro Street in Aro Valley, and the Waimapihi stream flows underneath this street still in a culvert essentially. This is one of the tributaries that disappears down into the culvert before it goes under the city, and it basically joins all these other streams that are underneath Wellington. This is a subset of streams beneath Wellington that was sampled by the City Council, showing what's underneath in these pipes still, some of them more modern, some of them very historic brickwork and things, but you can actually see that there's gravel in many of these streams, and they found fish and eels living still in the streams beneath Wellington that have been culverted. There's a whole bunch of unintended consequences to managing our rivers like this. The most obvious one, probably, or at least for me coming at it from as a graduated ecology student, I guess, was habitat loss. When we encroach upon our rivers, we literally just take away space that could have been habitat for fish and braided river birds, insects and macroinvertebrates. But we also change the way that the habitat in the river looks or functions. So things like our riffles and our rapids, our runs, which are those like smooth flowing bits, and the pools, which are the sort of swimming hole type areas, those are all good habitat for fish and birds and things and macroinvertebrates, and they need them for different life cycle stages. When we encroach on our rivers, when we straighten them or channelize them with stop banks or concrete or whatever, we tend to turn them more into long runs where it's sort of the same depth, the same speed, and we lose the little riffles and runs, we lose the swimming holes, and we lose that habitat diversity for our native species, which means they have less habitat. It's no surprise that 76% of our native fish are threatened with or at risk of extinction. So that's one thing, but there's a whole bunch of other sort of human-related consequences, although I say, this is obviously really connected to humans, especially if you like swimming in swimming holes. Another consequence we have is basically build-up of these rivers through time. A river, as I said, is not just water, it's also gravel and sediment. And these rivers historically have spread back and forward across a floodplain, spreading out that gravel and sediment. When we confine them with stop banks, like what's happened here in this cross-section of the Tukituki River, where you can see that the river historically has this sort of floodplain. This is like we've chopped through the river and it's sort of flowing out of the screen towards us. When we confine these rivers with stop banks, which you can see here in this cross-section, the river can't spread back and forward anymore and deposit sediment everywhere. It can only go down or up, either eating down into the gravels and taking them downstream or dropping them off and building up. And in this case, this river is building up between the stop bank corridors because it has nowhere else to go. And what that means is that you end up with a riverbed that's quite high and a floodplain that's a bit lower, with communities living on it at a lower elevation than the river. So if the river ever wants to jump out of those stop banks for some reason, as we're probably more likely to see going forward, those communities are in the path of that river, and it's very hard to get the river back onto higher ground into the channel that it had been forced to stay within. The worst example of this, to show you an extreme, is the town of Franz Josef, which you might have seen. Basically, this is Franz Josef here in the image at the top. There's a cross section on this red line. This is the Waiho River coming down here, and you can see that on this side of the river we've got State Highway 6. On this side of the river we've got Franz Josef Township, and this is the riverbed. This is the elevation of the riverbed. It is about 4 meters higher than the elevation of the town. The stop bank has had to be increased in height to keep up with the pace at which the river is building up because of all the gravel coming down from the Southern Alps, and there is basically no way that they can keep up with how fast this river is building up, except for letting the river go further downstream so that it can do something with the gravel instead of continuing to drop it here. And there's plans to do that, but it is taking a bit of time, to the point where the river geomorphologists, river experts had actually predicted where the river was going to burst next if they didn't hurry up and do something, and I think it was earlier this year or last year it did what they had predicted. So yeah, an extreme example, but a good one to show you why digging gravel out of the river isn't necessarily the solution, especially in places like this. Another consequence of managing rivers like this is the decrease in groundwater recharge that happens because of it. So our braided rivers in particular, for example, have this sort of large area of old gravels beneath them, and that can hold water in what's being referred to as a braid plain aquifer. And when the active river above it is nice and wide, it means there's a lot of space for that water that's flowing down the river to percolate into that gravel and then restore the actual aquifer. Down here is the regional aquifer beneath it. But we've narrowed a lot of our rivers, we've taken that space away from them that river can spread water across, and that means the water levels in the aquifer are dropping. And this is something that's happening in Hawke's Bay with the Ngaruroro, it's happening down in the Selwyn, and it's happening in your region with the Waido River, which was one of the rivers in this study. So we're pumping water out for irrigation, we're not letting the river recharge as well as it would have because we've confined it so much, and then we're not getting the groundwater levels at the stability that they would have been before. And that's a real risk for a whole bunch of reasons, including for irrigation and use for farming. Another problem with managing rivers this way is that we create an issue and then we tend to fight it downstream. We start this perpetual challenge of fighting a river. This is the Manawatu River in the North Island near Palmerston North, or at Palmerston North, in 1949. And I've highlighted two bits of the river here. It flows downstream from the top to the bottom, and you can see there's a bend here where the river was it wasn't threatening. People were worried that the river might burst out of this channel at some point and flood Hokowhitu, which was the suburb starting here. Nothing was done about it for many years. Eventually in the 90s, they pulled the river across and straightened that bend out to try and ease the pressure on that corner, I guess, given that Hokowhitu had become a heavily developed suburb. What it seems to have done is that it's taken a lot of that energy that was being dissipated around that corner and fired it down to this kind of hairpin bend here on the corner. And in the 40s, that wasn't a problem. This is that hairpin bend. There was one house up on top of this hill. This was a big marine terrace limestone thing. No big deal. Unfortunately, the council allowed a housing development to go in at the top of that hill. And then that meant that the erosion on that corner was becoming a risk to the properties there, and this all had to be lined with rock work. So doing one correction upstream created a need for another correction downstream because you changed where the erosion was happening, and you essentially end up fighting the river back and forward across and downstream until you decide that you're going to let it do its thing. And if you've been there, you'll know that there's rock work basically all along this section here too, and that then carries on further downstream through Palmerston North. And we essentially get this situation where we take these rivers that historically had a bit of space to move. This is the Mangone Stream in 1949 in Palmerston North again. We put in stop banks, as you can kind of see, starting to go in alongside this one at that point. And then because we expect that the river's not going to go anywhere, we just move in around them. So this is that same suburb now, around the Mangone Stream, heavily developed. And you essentially have this situation where you can walk along that stop bank and look into people's backyards. You've got this narrow confined stream where when it floods the water has nowhere to go but up, and should that water come over the top of the stop bank or blow through the stop bank, it's just going to go straight into the floodplain, into people's houses or businesses or schools with an enormous amount of energy. And that's the situation we have in many, many places. And it looks comical here, but you can in many places stand on these stop banks and look into people's backyards. If you're in Palmerston North, if you're in Upper Hutt, I think Wairoa has the biggest stop banks in the country. So it's they are roof height in some places. And it goes against essentially what our rivers are trying to do over time. This is the Manawatu River stepped back with what's called a LiDAR scan, so you can see all the historic paths of the river in the floodplain and those old terraces. Here's Hokowhitu and what we were looking at just before, with the city of Palmerston North, or the main part of Palmerston North being slightly up on an old terrace there, although lots of housing in this bit here. And even the regional council there has acknowledged this is unsustainable. You can't keep doing this forever. And you can see from another sort of LiDAR scan of the Wairoa River that there are all these historic places where the river has been through time, and at some point it might want to go back there. So there's also enormous cost to this, managing rivers this way. This is insurance payouts for weather-related damage through time, and you can see that 2023 was just absolutely massive. It exceeded that of the previous 14 years basically. And Treasury put the cost of asset damage between the Auckland floods and Cyclone Gabrielle at between 9 and 14.5 billion. That's not to mention the human impact, right? This is my friend rescuing a chicken from their property. Pretty low stakes, thankfully their house was okay. But I use it as a softer example of the fact that people lost loved ones, people lost their lives, people lost their houses, people lost businesses. Bridges were taken out, people couldn't travel back and forth across the region for months or even years afterwards. People can't go to sleep when it rains. All sorts of stuff that we don't think about and we don't price that impacts us because of these flood events. A couple of months before the cyclone, this paper was published, a couple of months really, called Reanimating the Strangled Rivers of Aotearoa, New Zealand. It was some river experts from around New Zealand basically looking at river management and saying, what is the consequence of this? What have we done? And they said things like working against nature does not work. We may inadvertently be manufacturing future disasters, and moving out of harm's way saves lives. Very prescient stuff before Cyclone Gabrielle. Very similar to some stuff that was written by the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment in 1988 after Cyclone Bola. They had said things like extensive deforestation has led to greatly accelerated widespread severe erosion, draining of wetlands has intensified flooding problems in many areas, and unwise intensive development behind stop banks has often been encouraged. So they basically said we put in stop banks and we didn't communicate to people that they only provide a certain level of protection. They don't protect us from everything. And then we just moved in behind them and expected that we would be safe. But there's still this residual risk that people did not know about and we weren't kind of aware about. Of course, there's been other reviews since. Hawke's Bay Independent Flood Review. Lessons must be learned from the fact that the flood completely overwhelmed the stop banks. And interestingly there, since the flood event, there's been a widespread desire to build new stop banks. So people just double down and say, we just need bigger walls, the council wasn't doing enough. But they're saying there was a whole stop bank network and it was overtopped. So that we can't just rely on stop bank networks because at some point they fail. There were relatively new housing developments in areas of known flood risk. We can't just keep building in these places that we know are potentially at risk. Lessons have not been learnt. And they said we need to reflect the evolving best practice of making room for the river. So instead of having narrow river channels with concrete and big stop banks where the river has nowhere to go but up during a flood, we have much wider areas given to these rivers. In some places it would be magical, and I'm increasingly thinking that we just need to get people out of the flood zone, out of the high risk floodplain, because that is the best way that you can avoid harm. But where we can't do that, these rivers need more space. If we can have more space for these rivers, wider channels between stop banks, we can have lower stop banks for the same size floods, which means if that stop bank is overtopped, the water has less energy because it hasn't got as much of a height to drop down into the floodplain. It means we have more space for riparian areas. It means the river can do its meandering better and have more habitat, more swimming holes for people, more aquifer recharge, more areas for wetlands in the riparian zones. Yeah, and more space for people, basically, so we can have so many co-benefits, including yeah, lower flood risk and lower residual flood risk if these systems then fail. And it's something we're seeing adopted across New Zealand, slowly but surely. When I started doing these talks, I found it hard to find examples of this. Increasingly, we're seeing the benefits of doing things this way. This is an example from Auckland. On the right here, you've basically got what this creek looked like before the cyclone, Auckland anniversary flood weekend. During the flood, it looked like this. But you'll notice that it's not a concrete little box like what I grew up next to with houses right up next to it. It's straightened, but it's been made to try and have some habitat in it, and it's been given enough space that when it flooded, those houses were not flooded. Those houses were up in the dry area, and 4 days later it was back like this at its low flow. So Auckland's got this program called Making Space for Water. Government's put in money to buy houses after the flooding event, and yeah, they've got more of this coming basically. Greater Wellington Regional Council, here's an example of the Hutt River, which flows down here. This is a pinch point in the river where if the river flooded, it would do something like $1 billion worth of damage. The Regional Council's bought all this property on this area here, spent about $100 million, I think, but to avoid potential $1 billion worth of costs, so that they could widen the river through this section while NZTA does some work on replacing this bridge or something. So that will all be turned back into green space, and the river will be given about 90 metres more room. Albeit not access to the full Lower Hutt floodplain, but given the constraints of a heavily developed area, they're trying to give this river more space to reduce risk to the community. And then this example here from the Horizons region. In a rural area, they had a stop bank that was already set back from the river, I think. Despite that, they were fighting the river across to the left of this image with willows and things that you can see in here, spending money on doing that, and they realised actually they were destroying the habitat of the river and doing that, and they could probably let it have this sort of mobility corridor where they actually try and put some native planting back into some of this area, stop fighting it quite so much, and let the river just sort of self-adjust within this wider corridor that they've got for it. So not necessarily, you know, it doesn't have to be a high-cost sort of retreat. Actually, they're just a change in management for how this river works. And then we've got examples like Auckland Council proposing to turn half of a golf course in Takapuna into a wetland so that people nearby aren't flooded. We have a national adaptation plan that says we should prioritise nature-based solutions, so things like making room for rivers. We have this climate strategy that the government's come out with that says we should use nature-based solutions. And we had a really incredible report come out from an expert working group on managed retreat, actually saying how we might gear up to deal with these extreme weather events and retreat from some of these places. It's had approximately 60 recommendations in it, a whole bunch of things like if someone's house is flooded and it's, you know, if it's their second or third home, if it's their batch, then maybe we don't compensate them. But if it is their family home and it's the one place they have to live, then we do compensate them. Things like this, ideas about how we might afford to do this if we have to. The new government came in and they got their own report done, weirdly. It was much shorter, only 16 pages as opposed to 292. And it was pretty quickly criticised by an author on the old one, Jonathan Boston, who said it was the most philosophically misguided, morally questionable, administratively inept and politically naive, one of the most politically naive documents he had seen in years. So we've got some good things happening and we've got some things that are really going to slow us down in how we adjust to this. And the government just came out a few days ago with their National Adaptation Framework. And this is the whole thing. This is the entire document that I put on this page for you to see. It's not very big. It doesn't really adopt this idea of how we can share this cost and how we can do things better and look after each other. And it leaves questions as to if we're just going to leave each other to try and pay for this ourselves, which is a real risk. We also had earlier in the last year stories like this, that new homes are being consented on floodplains still after the disaster. And we've got proposals to weaken our freshwater legislation or allow projects to be developed through the Fast Track Approvals Act without any consideration of, you know, all the usual protections that we might have in place for things like, are you building this in a flood zone? So, yeah, pros and cons. going on at the moment, but no doubt that we need to do things differently. So to quickly go through some things that I think are real priorities in the last few minutes of this. Firstly, vote. Voting is one of the most important things we can do to change how we live with our rivers. You've just voted in a local election, hopefully. There's another election coming up next year. We desperately need people who believe in climate change, who believe we need to act, who believe we need to get people out of harm's way, and who want to protect our rivers because they provide our drinking water, they provide our groundwater for irrigation, and they are a huge hazard to us if we don't learn to live with them better. We have these incredible documents at a regional and local level that we can have a say on, like our long-term plans that allocate things for what we prioritise in our regional parks. Do we, put native forest back on a hillside that the council owns, or do we put exotic forest, or do we farm it, or all these kinds of decisions. Do we help pay for people to move back from a river, or do we allow this river to retreat, to erode a bank slightly, or do we jump straight back in with willows? That stuff all comes down to councillors allocating money to decisions in your region, and you can tell them that you want things to be done differently through these processes, as well as rule setting processes like bylaws and regional plans and all sorts of things like that. We have some councils that have been really proactive and are just getting on with doing this stuff themselves. This is Dunedin's South Dunedin future plan. They've basically been looking at South Dunedin. It's likely to be inundated by coastal inundation, and they've gone ahead and just started talking to the community about how they could deal with it. Do we just pump all the water out? Do we build a seawall? Do we let water come straight back in? And this was the preferred option in their consultation, that they make space for water, basically a combination of letting the water in and trying to protect places that are a bit less vulnerable. They even had the idea potentially of starting a council fund where you allocate money into this fund over time. As houses come up for sale in South Dunedin, you would slowly buy them, you could rent them back to your community still, and at some point when you had a critical mass, maybe an entire street or something like that, or you had an extreme weather event, you could then say as a council, well, we're ready to retire those assets now, and you own them all already. And they were just doing that off their own, or had proposed to do that off their own accord, and I think that's an awesome thing that communities could be doing and governments should support. Finally, there is this work that's been done on nature-based solutions across different regions. This was one for the top of the south, looking at Tasman and Nelson and things. This was a webinar literally just a couple of weeks ago. People can find it if you want to. But they found that you could get minor to moderate reductions in flow and things by doing things like putting leaky barriers, so trying to hold water in the landscape basically in the Wakapuaka catchment. In the Motueka you could get minor to major reductions in flood size and speed, between 3 and 36%, by increasing vegetation, basically through things like pest control and stuff, floodplain storage, so more wetlands and things like that. And there's these studies that are now going on thanks to some Ministry for the Environment report funding, and this is some work that I think the region could look at and people might like to dive into. You can literally find this on this Resilient Rivers website, and I wish I could tell you more about it, but I haven't got a copy of the report. So but chase it up if you want to have a look and tell your councillors that they need to be doing this kind of stuff. I want to finish, and I hope we're just in time, so if we're a little bit late, but with this image of the Rangitata River from 1937. This is the river flowing from the top of the image to the bottom here. It had a north branch, it had a south branch, and this was Rangitata Island in the middle. More recently, that south branch is gone. It was blocked off, and it was all farmed, centre pivot irrigators and things like that. The riverbed itself had been grassed over and things like that. In 2019, when that river flooded, it went straight back to its old channel. These rivers know where they've been, they know the space they need, and when they have these heavy rainfall events and these high flows, they will take that space back if they need it, no matter what we try and do. And we've seen that happen all across New Zealand over and over and over. When the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment wrote that report in 1988, they said a possible effect of climate change is that cyclones of some form could pass close to New Zealand with increasing frequency. It may be that in retrospect the Bowler storm will not be regarded as such an extreme event. So they said that in 1988, and they were right. And they said in the interests of future generations, government cannot allow the nation's floodplain land to be unwisely used. So we're at a point now where we have to have a conversation 40 years later, 30 years later, about how we live with these rivers. We can't do what we did before. We can't keep trying to fight them. We can, but we need to know that the consequence of that is potentially more disastrous, and we actually need to learn to live with these rivers and allow them the space that they need to do these things safely, or they will take that space. If you want to learn more about this stuff, you can look up Forest and Birds Making Room for Rivers document. They've also got a nature-based solutions one. You might want to read this paper called Reanimating the Strangled Rivers of Aotearoa New Zealand. You can look up this news story that won the Science Media Journalist Award last year called Room for the River. It's about the flooding in Hawke's Bay and the Ngaruroro River and its encroachment. Or a couple of books here, Is a River Alive? Reimagining how we think of rivers. I've got it sitting on my bedside table to read. All these books, Water Always Wins and A River with a City Problem. One about a journalist going around the world to see how other places deal with flooding in their regions, parts of the world that go underwater for months of a year. And this one about Brisbane flooding. Basically how continually in Brisbane they have doubled down on more development, more housing alongside the river, thinking they can kind of protect or slow water by building dams upstream, and continuing to face the consequence of large floods doing enormous damage to people's livelihoods. Well worth a read. But that's it from me. I hope that's useful. I hope that helps you understand why it is that we're seeing these events happen. I hope it gives you some thoughts and ideas for things you can take to your communities and councils, and some things you can run with to try and think about how we might live differently with rivers in the future.
Thank you very much, Tom. You really have expanded our understanding. We it's about to turn 1 o'clock, and there may be some people of the 30 participants who have to return to work after their lunchtime. And if so, thanks for being with us. Hopefully there are others who are able to stay on for some Q&A. Write your questions into the Q&A box, and we will try to deal with them systematically. Perhaps while you're writing your questions into the Q&A box, I'll start with a question. And in a way, I feel a bit guilty asking you a question about local issues, but I'm seized with the idea that we need to know what should happen in order to advocate intelligently with our councils. How much of a plan now exists, say, for the Tasman area, and also for Nelson? How much is that plan in place, or how much does it need to be developed?
Yeah, good question. I'm not sure, to be honest. I'm not entirely sure. I know a lot of councils around the country were going around and getting climate impact assessments done, essentially looking at what the highest risks to them are in their regions. I presume your region is doing one or has one that's just been done, but I'm not sure. That would be a really good thing people could look for as a start to see how much of an emphasis flooding has been given. But I haven't seen lots of more proactive stuff, I guess, like the Dunedin South Futures thing coming out of the top of the South. But there's a lot of conversation, given you've just had a flood and you had the huge floods years ago with all the slash coming down and things, or the large woody debris. So it wouldn't surprise me if there are some good council staff somewhere that are really thinking about this, and I know there are some in your rivers teams and things that have been working on that nature-based solution study, for example, that do want to do things differently and know how to do it. It's just a matter of whether or not that's coming through into council strategies and stuff. So I'm not sure, but there's good people there.
Thank you very much. So here's a question from Josh Lanehauers. Any learnings from the Netherlands, where they've been in more recent years moved from containment focus to creating space for flooding, in particular with regards to funding, co-benefits, farm community buy-in, cross-boundary collaboration? There in the Netherlands, it's international. Here, it would be cross-council. Any comments on that, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, so generally, as a start, we basically took this campaign when we started it at Forest and Bird from that Netherlands idea. They have a Room for the River project where they had something like 30 large-scale projects that they were looking at, doing all sorts of things, from essentially digging new channels for rivers to make space for water to increasing stop banks heights, but also setting them back further. Lots of like room for the river type projects with slightly more of a focus on an engineering basis. But that's kind of where we started, because this is much more widely used in Europe and other parts of the world than it was here when we started this. So that was the first place we were looking for things. But a couple of things I can remember that I quite liked from the Netherlands were things like, they had designed these floodplains almost, or designed their projects so that their floodplains would still flood, once every 70 years or whatever. So when they said, right, no one can build in this part of the floodplain, it was expected generally that that floodplain would flood at least once in a lifetime. So every family would remember that that floods, and that's why we don't live there. And instead of creating this idea that it's constantly dry, and then you get a catastrophic flood, and people don't understand why it had flooded. So things like that I quite liked. I'm not sure about what they've done in terms of funding and community buy-in and things like that. But there's stuff that can be learned, I think, from there. But I think we're starting to get an idea of how we can do this in New Zealand now with some of the projects that we've got and the more sort of smaller scales we've got in terms of communities.
Speaking of learning from other countries' experience, I read a bit about dam removal in Europe and North America. Is that relevant in New Zealand?
From a flood perspective, probably not so much generally, although I'm not super sure on this. But most of our I've never heard of a dam in New Zealand that was built as a flood protection dam. In Brisbane, for example, they essentially built some dams upstream to try and hold water, partly for flooding, but they also have to fill them up partly to use them for drinking water sources. So they have this, some people want the dam level higher for more drinking water, some people want it lower for more flood protection. But they've had problems over there with that. If people find that book a river with a city problem, you can read about it. It's super interesting. We don't have many dams like that in New Zealand that I'm aware of, if any. It may be that dams on the Waikato, for example, do help regulate flood levels, because you've got 7 of them or whatever it is the whole way down, and you can control where water is at every section of the river. But in other places, generally our dams are held quite high because we want water in them to create, power and things. So it doesn't kind of have an influence on the flows that I'm aware of.
Okay. So another question is, how do we afford to buy people out who live in the river floodplains?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So at the moment, the way we do it is essentially after the event. We have a big flood. We decide maybe that these places shouldn't be lived in anymore, and then everyone argues about who should pay for it and what they should pay. It tends to be that they pay kind of market rate, and with Cyclone Gabrielle and Auckland and Auckland, for example, I think government went in with 50%, central government, and local government went in with 50%. And that becomes enormously expensive because land prices are quite high in New Zealand. We have had very high capital gains. Council rates are relatively low, and taxes in New Zealand are relatively low. So government doesn't want to spend money, local council doesn't want to spend money, and the people moving off the land want the full value that they expect to get for their property. So it makes it very hard and very expensive to do small areas of retreat. This government's come along and kind of said, right, everyone's probably going to be on their own in about 20 years. It's your problem if you live on flood-prone land. I think that's a really bad idea generally, a bad way to approach it. And that's why that expert working group had actually said, well, let's come up with some rules for how we could potentially do this affordably. And it could be things like we only compensate people up to $1 million. If they own a $5 million house on the coast and it's inundated, we kind of expect that they were probably rich enough that they could cope with this. It's not going to be the end of the world for them. Their livelihood is not going to collapse. There might be nuances in that people have had these properties for a long time and they've had huge capital gains. But basically they had recommendations for how we could deal with these kind of things, like I said earlier. I think what we need is personally, I think we need to correct that capital gains problem. Our property values should not be so high. Our rates and taxes should not be so low. If we had more resource for councils and government and less obsession with people just having this absurd idea that their house is worth a huge amount of money, therefore they're kind of well off even though they still have to buy in the same market, we could do better as a community to look after each other, because we could afford to buy people out, shift people to safer land and not deal with that consequence. I think that would be a massive thing, and I think the government should pick up more of the recommendations from that expert panel to help buy these communities out. And we should be, ultimately, what we need to be doing is this, that we know proactive retreat is cheaper in the long term than dealing with the consequence of the event in terms of the rebuild itself and the impact on livelihoods and families and things. And if you want to dig into that, I highly recommend, there's another book from America called Seek Higher Ground that looks at the American way of doing this, and they basically government guarantees people that they will pay them out if their house is destroyed. And there are houses that they have, every couple of years these houses are rebuilt because they keep getting impacted, and it's draining the American economy from a flood perspective. So yeah, highly recommend having a look at that. But lots to talk about there, sorry, but yeah, we'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Here's a question from Nino, who also says, thanks very much for your talk, and asks, do you have any advice on things we can do for local streams running through our backyards? We recently had one flood in our backyard when watercress partially blocked a culvert.
Yeah, really hard to give specific advice on local streams because you run into this problem where one thing you do that can be really nice for your section of stream, like planting it up, can potentially slow the flow, which can lead to it backing up and flooding elsewhere, or it could slow the flow and help people downstream. So it's really hard to know what you might do and even what you're allowed to do. Some councils, the expectation is that you as the landowner will keep the stream on your property or near your property clear. And if you don't, I think you can still be fined about £1 a day every day that you don't do that. It still exists in this 1938 Soil Conservation and River Control Act. So the best thing I'd do is probably go and talk to council and say, hey, what can I do? What are you doing? Here's the things I care about for my community, and even get people together to talk about those things. I think that would be one of the best things. We had an example in Havelock North that I really get frustrated with to some degree, where their stream flooded and everyone around it started just pointing fingers at the council and blaming the council. And I would have loved if the first thing that everyone had done together with the council was actually sit down and look at old maps of the region and go, why did this stream flood into our backyards? What used to be here? Where are the houses now? Because it's not necessarily just that the council's not doing enough. Sure, that might be part of the problem with the way that we manage the rivers now, but it also might be that they live in what was a wetland or what was one of the stream bed areas, and then come up with a plan as a community about what you do with that stream. So I think those would be awesome conversations that you could start.
Mm. A helpful comment here from someone from Tasman Environmental Trust points out that the Motueka Catchment Collective has just released a first draft of their catchment plan, which does include nature-based solutions for flood response. So thank you. That looks like something that would be helpful to look at. Seb Dendonka asks, intensive forestry seems to be an issue in the Motueka catchment, with erosion and a lot of fine sediments discharged into the river. But the forestry lobby is high and powerful. What can we do? Any ideas?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, vote. That's really important. We have a government at the moment that's very pro-development and pro-resource extraction, whatever the consequence for people downstream. I think that's really problematic, and I think that one of the best things we can do is vote to change that. And then pressure on your politicians, on your local politicians, writing to local MPs, writing to your local councillors, continuing to just tell them how much of an issue this is the main other thing that we can do. I think all these processes that are about to come up, consultation on new resource management law and things like that, I think it's really important that people try and engage in those. I know it's been exhausting, but if you can write to your MP and make submissions and then vote, that's probably the most powerful things that you can do as individuals with others around you as well.
Thank you. And the Tasman Environmental Trust person is saying that the Motueka Catchment Collective is trying to engage with Tasman District Council on their response to floods, which is really helpful to know. Seb asks a further question. After the local floods, the recent river works on the Motueka River were mostly rebuilt as before, stop bank and rock walls. How to persuade river managers from council and the politicians to change practices like using nature-based solutions.
Yeah. So as I understand it, the way the system works is that if, for example, a piece of stop bank gets eroded or something, the government will come in and say, okay, we can help fund you to put that stop bank back the way it was because you need to repair your infrastructure. So if you have a $200,000 cost to put that back in or something, they'll help you fund that. If you say to them, oh, well, we could retreat the stop bank back a little bit actually because there's a bend, it sticks out and we want to straighten it and pull it back from the river, but you need to buy a piece of land and that's going to cost you $50,000 or $100,000 or whatever, the government won't fund you to do that. Even though you'll give the river a bit more room and you'll make the system better, they won't pay for it. So it becomes a decision for the councillors or the council managers to make to actually spend that extra money and do better. That's enormously problematic. We should have a system that says we're going to make the system better every time we have to fix it. So that's a flaw. We actually don't have a system for government funding or co-funding this stuff. It's all down to councils basically. Every few years the government decides they want to allocate a bit of money in the budget to councils to do better flood protection works, but otherwise it's all up to the councils individually to pay for these things no matter what state they've were handed them years and years ago. So actually I think we need that system to change. So we need a government that's going to change the funding system for councils. Councils essentially need more money because everyone hates paying the higher rates, so we do need central government to help support councils to do better. And often it's not just the river managers. Increasingly the river managers do want to do better, I think, but they are stuck with these lines that the river's been put in and communities that live right up around them. And without a system from central government that says here's how we're going to pay for managed retreat or whatever, it's really hard to do. But there are opportunities like in the Horizons, for example, where they already had a wider river and they could give it a bit more space. So I think we can still nudge councillors. The more we're nudging councillors and communities to think about this stuff, the more apparent or obvious it's going to be that we do need to do things differently, and that is the solution. So yeah, it's going to be hard, but I think we just have to keep banging the drum, and then every few years or every year it rains hard, and we tell them again that we've got to get out of the way. We've got to change the way we live with our rivers.
And Tasman Environmental Trust points out that they're trying to engage Motueka Valley community members through a series of hui. The first was the middle of last month. Excellent. I was there. Very good. And they've got another one planned for November. So note, listeners, that this would be worth going to and continue the dialogue on this topic at Motueka Catchment Collective in November. Look out for the notice. Yeah, Carl Upson says, thanks, Tom. The communication I've seen from you tends to focus on riverine systems, large floodplains, and the impact of management practices on locals. It seems to me that's the sharp end of the wedge, the local, visible, and relatable end of the system. But it all starts in the myriad headwaters. Where do you see that balance of action between wider holistic water cycle management versus addressing resulting rivers? Seems very little funding support regulatory enablement exists for local streams.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I think more and more that's where I'm getting to as well. It's like, yeah, I'm talking about the flooding that happens at the town or community level or whatever, but the problem starts in a whole different part of the catchment. It may be that even if we restored a whole catchment, we're still going to have communities in some places that are on the floodplain that the river needs, and that's still the sharp end of the wedge type problem. But I think you're right that this is making room for rivers for me now is a way of starting a conversation with communities to start thinking about the landscape they live in. Where is the river in their community or the stream that they can't even see anymore maybe? Where did it used to be? Where has it gone through time? What is the river story, I guess, which is a concept which has been used with the Te Hoiere catchment, if people look that up, of starting to look at that river through time and its story. And by starting that conversation, you get people thinking about, well, what do we use the floodplain for? What are we using the catchment for? And hopefully seeing themselves as part of that greater context. But I think you're right that everything upstream and downstream of it is connected to this river and what it's doing, and that by learning to live with the rivers, I hope that starts a conversation about actually what it means to live in that landscape and what we can sustainably do in it. So yeah, using it as a way in, I hope, that then gets people to realise that we do need to change the whole system.
Okay, here's the last question from Seb again. River mining or gravel extraction has been intense since the recent floods on the Upper Motueka River and others, but hydromodeling shows that it's not effective and also it is not nature friendly. Why continue to do such practices?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I wasn't aware of the explicit hydro modelling that shows that it's not effective. I knew generally that it is not that effective, so I'd be super interested to see that because it helps my argument. But yeah, so generally these big floods happen. Tuki is an example. It was also, I think maybe in the Motueka or somewhere down there, after the floods there were calls from farmers and things like that. The council just needs to get in and dig the gravel out of the river. But the problem, as I sort of showed to you, is that these rivers aren't just water, they're gravel as well, and that gravel is moving through the system in fits and starts. It's not just this conveyor belt that's constantly filling up a spot, and if you dig it out, you'll have a bit more space for water. That gravel affects everything about the river, the slope of the river, because if it builds up in one spot, it changes the slope, or if you dig it out at one spot, it changes the slope, and that changes the flow and the dynamics of that river, and it changes the coastal erosion if that gravel is not getting all the way to the coast. So there's all these things that gravel is doing that we tend to ignore. Basically, why do we still do it? It seems like I think there's a bunch of engineers that probably still think it is the way to go, or at least it helps with the smaller floods sometimes maybe, so dig it out. There's probably councils that want to be seen as if they're doing something, or just want to do what people are telling them to do and that don't know any better, so they spend money on doing it. There's gravel extraction companies that want the gravel in some of these places for roading and things, so they're doing it. And yeah, we kind of just indoctrinated, I think, into this way of this is what we have to do. Whereas in reality, it might be that, you know, we could leave that gravel building up and then eventually the river will start to pick it up and take it with it, or it will start depositing it somewhere else, or actually what we probably need to do is get the people out of that floodplain if there's a flood risk, because yes, we can take the gravel out and reduce the small floods a little bit, but as soon as there's a huge flood, like I showed you the images of the Tutakuri, a bit of gravel extraction in that section of river would not have changed the fact that that river just needed the floodplain. It needed to go everywhere. So we have to communicate that to people, I think, that this is not as simple as just dig the channel out and make it bigger. Rivers are complex things, they're living things, and we have to accept that if we're going to live with them going forward.
Well, I think you really have helped us to understand that, Tom, and there was a good deal of appreciation in the Q&A comments that people wrote in. I myself am really grateful for the expansion
Yeah,
in.
well, thanks for everyone hanging around. I know we ran a little bit late at the start. Partly that was me trying to get extra slides in to make sure I had things to talk about specifically to Tasman that I had seen in recent days and wanted to put in there. So yeah, thanks for hanging around and asking questions, and impressed that so many of you have as well. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Tom, for an excellent presentation. I'll close with a karakia. And I want to thank the participants for their very thoughtful questions. And we need, I think, to somehow get it into a few messages that we can advocate on with our council. So the closing karakia has a water theme. We've been out. The metaphor is that we've been out in a waka together, rowing to our destination, and now we're back on the beach, ending this phase together. Ko te hā, ko te rā, ko Tangaroa, ko te mana, Ko te kotahitanga o ngā māta waka. Haumi e, hui e, taiki e.
Taiki.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks to our tech person, Marlene,
Yeah.
for
Yeah,
so
thanks, Marlene.
competently bringing this to everyone.